And it shows that, with the vaccines, a lot of people ask me, do you think there's any vaccines that are good, or are all vaccines bad? Well, the thing is that they all have a trade-off. And if I know for a fact that there were tens of thousands of cases of measles every year before that vaccine came out. So I know that the vaccine was effective at reducing the incidence of measles. The death rate was declining on its own before the vaccine was introduced, absolutely. But in terms of cases, absolutely. Same with chickenpox. The chickenpox vaccine came out in 1995, and I worked with Dr. Gary Goldman. He was heading up at the CDC, working with the CDC to monitor in Antelope Valley, California, when that vaccine was introduced. And they watched when 10% of the people were vaccinated, 20, 30, 40, 50% of the population in the community was vaccinated, and they watched the number of cases in the hospital systems go down. But is that the only way we measure whether a vaccine is good or bad, beneficial or detrimental? No, okay, because I'll tell you that, for example, the several studies, my favorite chapter in this book is Cancer and Natural Infections, where several studies show that when you contract these diseases, measles, mumps, chickenpox, rubella, as a child, it provides you with protective benefits in later life. It protects you against various types of cancer. Women that contract mumps as a child, they're protected against ovarian cancer. If you contract measles and mumps, rubella, chickenpox, you will be protected against lymphoma. You'll be protected against leukemia. You'll be protected against brain tumors. And so this is study after study shows this. A new study that just came out a couple of years ago out of Japan by Kubata and colleagues, they discovered that they looked at 100,000 adults, and what they found was that they trailed them for several years. They found that adults who had measles, who contracted measles or mumps as children, are protected against fatal heart attacks and strokes in adulthood. So if you just look at measles and the measles vaccine and you say the measles vaccine is wonderful, it reduced cases, you're overlooking the fact, the flip side is that when you get that vaccine, you're preventing people from having those protective, they're not contracting that disease in childhood, and you're forcing them to have higher cancer rates in later life, or higher rates of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and strokes. So there's a trade-off. And this is one of the reasons why it's imperative that this remains a decision of free choice, why they can't mandate. Who are they to play God and to say, we're going to keep you from getting measles, but we're going to force you to have a higher risk of developing cancer or dying from heart attacks and strokes? So
I agree with that.
So there's lots of interesting studies.
A lot of people argue efficacy, that vaccines don't work. For the most part, they do. Whooping cough has some issues. There are vaccines out there that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. But measles vaccine does lower your rate of measles. So I don't get into the argument whether or not that works. The argument really is more, do you want it? I want my kids to get measles. I want them to get chickenpox. I want them to get chickenpox so I don't get shingles. This is something that a lot of people don't know, that if your child gets chickenpox, if you had chickenpox, you get a natural boosting by being around your children with chickenpox. The reason, so we may have eliminated chickenpox, but we have a shingles crisis because none of us are in contact with children who are getting chickenpox. That's just one of many stories where the pharmaceutical industry has thrown everything out of balance in a desire to either make money or play God and get involved with nature. They've messed the system up. And that's part of what I contemplate. One of the things that always surprised me was Andy Wakefield and Suzanne Humphreys, who I've talked about a lot, or talked with a lot, are afraid if everyone just stops vaccinating that we will have real issues with disease. One of the reasons being that the measles vaccine has put all of our babies at risk. This is something nobody wants to talk about. But when we got natural measles, the mother was, first of all, we had immunity for life. And by the way, some of that efficacy really was the fact that we had an older population that were fully immune for life, that sort of held the wall, and then newly vaccinated, I think, bolstered the numbers of herd immunity. And as we now have those that naturally got the diseases dying off, we're seeing more and more problems of like holding herd immunity together. So what is the most important thing to achieve herd immunity? People that actually got the disease and are these rocks in the center holding on to herd immunity. Without them, I don't think science is going to achieve it. But essentially, if you get measles as a mother, as a young girl, you pass that immunity on to your baby for the first year and a half. You breastfeed, that could extend maybe out to 2 years. And at 2 years old, your child is perfectly capable of handling measles. But now that we have replaced natural measles with a vaccine, we've created a massive problem. Our mothers, when you are vaccinated, you do not pass on any immunity to your baby. So for the first time in history, every baby being born is tragically and dangerously vulnerable to measles. And that's why you have this insane push that we got to get these kids vaccinated, because they're terrified.
I think that
they're
measles,
gonna-
yeah, I think you're right. And the measles is the one, I think, that would cause the most problems.
Yeah.
Because what happened was that that before the vaccine came out in 1963, all the young girls caught measles. And then when they became young women and had babies, they passed maternal antibodies on to their babies. For 15 months, that protected those babies. And now today, since everybody's been vaccinated, there's no real maternal antibodies to be passed on to these babies. So what happens, before the vaccine came out, less than 0.5% of all cases of measles occurred in infants. And now today, more than 40% of all cases are in infants. And you have to understand that when you catch these childhood ailments, I'm talking about these viral diseases like measles, mumps, chickenpox. These diseases are relatively innocuous when you get them from about the age of 1.5 to about 10. That's when 85 to 95% of all children used to catch these diseases. If you get these diseases as an infant or as a teenager or adult, they're much more serious. Mm-hmm. You can end up with severe complications. There's the same problem with the chickenpox. All 85 to 95% of the people as children caught chickenpox. If you catch it as a teenager or adult, you can have some serious complications. But now, the chickenpox vaccine doesn't really provide an honest efficacy. And so this is why they've gone up to two doses. They're pushing with the booster doses. What's the answer what's the industry's answer to an ineffective vaccine? To just give it more of it.
More. I know. I was at ACIP this year, and they're having mumps outbreaks amongst fully vaccinated communities in college, and so they just said they were all voting on, let's add a third measles, mumps, rubella vaccine.
The problem now is that when these people that didn't catch chickenpox naturally, that they are likely to develop it as a teenager or adult, because the vaccine is not going to provide long-term benefits. So the industry has created a killer disease, especially with measles, and so I think that if they did stop all vaccinating, I think that measles would cause the most problems. Because another thing that you have to understand about a disease, when a disease hits a virgin population, it's the fatality rates and the rates of complications are much higher. So, for example, in the early days when measles would hit a virgin population, you might have anywhere from 5 to 15% of the people dying from that disease, especially if their vitamin A storages are low. But once the population has adapted to the infection, then you gain a sort of an immunity, and the virility of the disease declines. Now, by 1963, that's exactly what happened when the measles death rate had declined. It was no longer a killer disease, at least here in the United States. Now, it is still problematic in third world nations. But why? Well, because we're dealing with malnutrition, we're dealing with poor water supplies, we're dealing with sanitation, we're dealing with inadequate emergency medical care. And that will contribute to these high infant mortality rates and high rates of complication and death associated with diseases like measles. But here in the United States, that has really, those death rates and severity of the disease had declined by the time that vaccine was introduced. But today, if they were to stop all measles vaccines, you would have to start over with that virility. It would be like an entirely new virgin population that was being re-exposed to a new disease. And so that would be problematic.
You know, when we talk about your question was, what are some of the science that I enjoy? You should really look into aluminum right now. There's some great studies come out from Chris Shaw and Chris Exley especially, that just did a study on the brains of autistic people. He had 5 brains and saw the highest levels of aluminum ever recorded. The previous highest record was the brains of people with Alzheimer's. So that gives you a sense, and we are all looking at the fact that aluminum may be causing Alzheimer's. But for me, recently I had an opportunity to talk to Teresa Deischer, who I found very fascinating. And I think it's an interesting story because this is where sort of religion and I think science sort of collide in a very interesting way. She's looking at the MMR vaccine, which does not have aluminum or mercury. It can't because it would kill the live virus. So the question would be, if aluminum is proving to cause all this autism, why would the MMR be blamed by many parents as having caused autism? And what she's looked at is the fact that we're using aborted fetal tissue. Now everyone's heard that. Some people will say, oh, that's not true. More and more, and when I go to speak to health committees now, they're saying, okay, it is true. We know we don't want to get caught with our pants down. We do use aborted fetal tissue. For the rubella vaccine, we grow rubella on it, and we grow varicella, the chickenpox vaccine. But here's what's interesting. When we started using aborted fetal tissue, we grow the virus on it, and we know there's no way to extract the DNA. Once the virus is grown on there, we're going to put it in a vaccine. We can't extract the DNA out. It's attached. And so we knew in the beginning of this process, we were going to be putting foreign DNA from a dead baby into our perfectly healthy child. And there was some suspicions that that could be problematic by the scientists involved. We had no way of testing it, and of course we don't really test anything very well, but in their infinite wisdom, they decided, let's just chop the DNA strands, just split them up into tiny little fragments instead of letting these long DNA strands float around in this foreign body. And what Teresa Deischer has been working on, by the way, she's one of our top stem cell scientists in the world. This is not, as I said to her the other day, I said, how are you seen in your community? She's like, if I decide to do a study on stem cells, I will have $30 million in the bank tomorrow. When I decide to look into vaccines, it's a much different story. But what she said, and she put it very clearly, she said these fragments are the problem. Chopping this DNA up was the biggest mistake we made because we now know that the DNA strands in our own cells can absorb tiny fragments and mutate our own cells. And you might say, well, that's crazy. I said, well, how do you prove that? She's like, it's a known fact because if you talk to a gene scientist that are looking at gene splicing, what are they doing? They are working on injecting a fragment of a DNA to fix a problem in your DNA. The problem they've had, and why we don't see everybody using gene therapy, is they still can't get it to land exactly in the spot they want it to land in. And if that fragmented DNA goes somewhere else, you have cancer. You have all of these other issues. You have autism. And so the MMR vaccine, we're injecting fragments. In fact, she spoke to one of the top gene scientists in the world and said, what if I told you that we use vaccines and we inject DNA fragments into children that are healthy? They said, I hope that's not true because that would be catastrophic.